I went straight home and I told my roommate, hey, Brian is getting married and I'm best man. And he said, do you think you can do that? And I was like, well, yeah, because you're just the guy closest to him, right? He's like, no, there's other stuff too. And I got extremely uncomfortable. I said, other stuff like what? He said, well, you have to give a speech as like the main thing. And I panicked and I asked Brian who the other groomsmen were, and I texted them asking if they wanted to trade. None of them got back, and so I hunkered down and tried writing a speech. And it was not going well. I asked again my roommate, I'm like, all right, so you know everything about being best man. So if you're president of being best man, then like what's a good best man speech? And he said, well, you can talk about something, like tell a fun story from when he was younger that people who know him now maybe don't know about him or whatever, just explain to Tam. She's always like, tell a fun story about Brian when he was young. I'm like, I don't want to. And so I sat down and tried to do that. I wrote a speech. I wrote most of a speech. I pitched it to my roommate. He did not like it. I'll tell you why after. I did not have time to rewrite it. I had no time to revise it. But I'd like to paint a portrait, if you'll allow me, of where Brian and I came from and what our lives were like, and where this amazing and lucky man you see before you today came from. I hope I don't embarrass you too much. Brian was a little bit of a late bloomer, and you wouldn't know it by now. He's got like a fast car and a hot wife, so you wouldn't really expect that. That just happened. That's like super recent. So anyway, I hope I don't tear up. Brian and I were raised in a small town called Sagal, Idaho. Deep in the panhandle just south of Canada, Sagal now boasts several mini storage units and an ATV dealership. But during the supple and delicate years of our childhood, it seemed almost untouched. We were raised in a modest home tucked discreetly between mighty forests and vast fields where young boys could catch grasshoppers and recline carefree for hours, just staring at the sky and watching the clouds float lazily by. And I did. Brian, however, had very little interest in leaving the house, which was best, as he was the family embarrassment. Brian was one of those children who, even if you knew he had washed his hands before dinner, you wouldn't eat bread from the basket if he had reached in before you, because he just seemed gross. As long as I can remember, he was always unnaturally clammy, even in the cold seasons. He was one of those kids who didn't learn to breathe through his nose until he was 19 or 20. So his company always came with a raspy, labored breath that seemed to instantly humidify any space that he occupied. He spoke only rarely, which was in everyone's best interest, as encounters with him were, without exception, uncomfortable. When he did speak, it was very slow and clumsy. He would stare at you, almost through you, with an inhuman intensity, and he would talk so loud. He spat with every syllable, and just when you would think he had to be almost out of spit, his body would somehow produce more. He was at least either unwilling or unable to listen to anything you would have to say, so it was easy to autopilot through conversations with him, which were always about one of two things. One was his favorite food, macaroni and cheese. Or as Brian called it, macabroni and cheese. Growing up, Brian could never remember if his name was Brian or Ryan. So when Mom and Dad were having what I called good days, they would sit down with him and try to help him. Be Ryan, Brian, be Ryan, just over and over and over again, trying to get him to learn his own name. An unfortunate side effect of this was he started adding B's before random R's where they did not belong. So macaroni and cheese was macabroni and cheese. And he lived for it. It was one of his two passions. The other thing Brian talked about as long as I can remember was marriage. When Brian would occasionally venture out of the windowless basement where my parents would bitterly deliver macaroni twice daily, he would corner you and burden you with his company. He would often say things like, and I'm gonna get married someday, it's gonna be the best wedding probably ever, there's gonna be macaroni and all my friends, and it's gonna be the perfect day. Obviously, there was no sport in arguing with him or trying to convince him otherwise, so we would all just smile and nod. None of us heartless enough to shatter his delusional fantasies. It seemed innocent enough. One cold winter night, I accompanied our mother to town while she ran errands. Brian stayed behind, as was the family custom. I behaved so well during the errands, my mom let me rent a video game. I remember it clearly because it was Secret of Mana, and it's a really good Super Nintendo game I heard was so cool, and that's what makes this night so vivid in my head. I remember driving home with this game, so excited to play it. I remember pulling into the driveway and seeing the house ahead of us, so dark other than a faint flickering light in the living room. I walked slowly towards the house, our mother lagging behind me because she was struggling to carry groceries because her arms were so small. I entered the living room and it never seemed so big before. The shadows seemed to spill forever outward from my mother's piano, which was lined in candles. A figure in a white gown sat at the piano, clumsily pounding away at the keys. A semicircle of stuffed animals surrounded the piano. In the center of the circle was a large teddy bear covered in macaroni and something else crusty. I suppose it was the groom, but I realized suddenly the tune being slaughtered was Here Comes the Bride. He was clumsily pounding like it was awful. My mother entered. She dropped the groceries and she screamed, "Brian, what the fuck?" He spun around and I realized he was wearing our mother's wedding gown. Again, she yelled, "What the fuck?" And Brian just yelled back, stupidly and confidently, "It's my big day!" And Mom said, "No, no, 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 no," and she approached him. Brian repeated himself, "It's my big day!" As though trying to convince her. She grabbed him by her own gown, which fit very poorly, as Brian was about 17 at the time. She pulled him up to his feet, and he stood almost a full foot higher than her, but she still shook him and yelled, "You look like shit right now. You look like shit to me right now. You know what happens to shit? Do you know what happens to shit? Shit gets cleaned up." She dragged him to the bathroom, and I followed, and it was at that point she turned on the lights, and I could see he had done his best to do makeup for his big wedding day, and her makeup, he had lipstick on his teeth, and it has his face curled and contorted. It just looked awful. He looked like a cheap 13-year-old prostitute, but in a bad way. And she said it was time to shower, and it was her dress, and I would have guessed she could remove it so forcefully because it was allegedly important to her. And she put him in the shower, and my mom always had this rule growing up. Trying to remember how it went. Losers don't get warm water. And so she put him in the shower with cold water. And of course there's no way to regulate, so she would always sit on the toilet when Brian was showering, and she would keep one hand in there to make sure Brian couldn't use warm water because he was not allowed, because he never impressed her. And Brian, he was crying so loud that night, I remember, and he could not breathe through his nose, if you'll remember right. So it was just like, and he said, "This is my big day." And Mom, I remember Mom over and over again. She's so small, I don't know how I could hear her over the shrieking. She just said, "Losers don't cry." Winners don't cry. Winners don't cry. Winners do not cry. That's what you said over and over again that night. And I remember, I was like, I wanted to play my video game, but you were just Like, he was crying, and you were just saying, "Winners don't cry," over and over again. And it was shortly after that, my parents split and the entire family became estranged. We never really knew what happened to Brian until he invited us to this thing we're all at. And we were very skeptical because he said it was a wedding and we already had preconceived notions of what that meant to him. But he actually threw something together, and at the time, I felt like Mother's corrections, as she called them, were harsh and unfair, but Brian is wearing the pants at this wedding, and his bride is like smoking hot. So, Mother, you did something right. I mean, can't argue with the results. Anyway, Brian and Tam, I'm super happy for you. Brian, I hope that once Tam gets her citizenship, she doesn't leave you for someone closer to her own age. And Tam, you are a wonderful, beautiful, amazing lady. So happy to have you in my family.